Hi, this is Dan Olsen, founder of Lean Product Meetup. I'm excited to bring you another great speaker tonight. This was actually our 6-year anniversary. I founded Lean Product Meetup 6 years ago, and we've grown to over 8,600 members. So I just want to thank all of our members and attendees, our great speakers, our awesome sponsors, and all the volunteers that help make this happen. Tonight, I was excited to host David Bland. David is the co-author of this awesome book, Testing Business Ideas, published by Wiley, who also published my book, The Lean Product Playbook. We actually have the same editor. And he co-wrote it with Alex Osterwalder, who wrote Business Model Generation, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, the business model canvas. But it's a great book with a lot of awesome advice on how to test your business ideas. And given the situation, we actually did a webinar instead of a live event. One of the advantages of that is we were able to have attendees from all over the world. So that was a nice plus. And David gave a great talk and sharing advice from his book. And we also had a lot of great Q&A. So hope you enjoy it. If you do like it, please make sure to like it and subscribe to our channel and sign up notifications. So that way, when we have a new video, you'll get notified. Enjoy. I'm really excited to host tonight's speaker, David Bland. David is the founder of Precoil. He's a lean startup guru. Basically, he and I speak at a lot of the same conferences, Mind the Product, Lean Startup Conference, things like that. He is a co-author of this awesome book, Testing Business Ideas, with Alex Osterwalder, who's the author of Business Model Generation. Before that, he was an advisor at Neo Innovation. He worked at AOL and ComScore. There's his Twitter handle again. But I'm really excited to turn it over to him so he can share advice from his new book with us. So I'm going to stop share and turn it over to David. All right, David, take it away, please.
Sounds good. Thank you. So yeah, I'm just excited to be here. It's yeah, I've been a fan of like this meetup for a long time, so it's always awesome to kind of just get some you know get connected even virtually while we're all kind of isolated. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the book and also give you a little bit of behind the scenes of like why we wrote the book. Because you might think, well, why do you need another book on testing business ideas? And so I'm going to explain that. And then, yeah, ask hard questions. Fill up that Q&A box as we go, because I love hard questions. So put me on the spot for sure at the end. So a lot of it is, hey, why do you write a book? you know, and it's really kind of the wrong question, right? And so we started thinking about all the teams we've worked with throughout the years, and it really came down to sort of business design and testing. And so basically, I'll draw a little bit here for you. So it's almost like a figure eight. Like you want to come out and you want to make a decision on a new idea, right? But this idea of, all right, well, there's not just testing, there's also business design, and how do we go through that process as well. And so what we ended up doing with Alex Osterwalder and myself was, okay, so basically, how do you go through this ideation process? And then from there, how do you start creating business prototypes? So I think, some of the mistakes we make earlier on is we're so customer focused and jobs to be done focused, which I love, by the way. I love those frameworks. But at the same time, you need to be able to, align to corporate strategy. And I think that's why, a lot of these innovation labs get shut down, is because they find a really meaningful customer job, but they didn't really spend enough time business prototyping and understanding how it connected to strategy. And unfortunately, a lot of those great YouTube videos you go out and watch of innovation labs, they're just no longer there anymore. And so I was really, really disturbed by that. So, in the book, we decided, okay, based on what we've seen with Team Successful, what are the things they do as far as business prototyping? And then how do you assess your business? So, is this a really interesting opportunity to explore? And so that is also kind of part of the process. And then let's make a decision, and let's start making high level decisions on like where do we place our bets, and go through that process. And then from there, how do we create hypotheses? So a lot of assumptions mapping and things that I've kind of been pushing over the years. How do you kind of look through desirability, viability, feasibility from design thinking on your opportunity? How do you kind of start breaking that down into where's our risk? Like, what's the most important thing that we know the least about? And then how do you design an experiment from that, right? Because you want to take that and make it something testable and then run that experiment, right? And so that's really important. And then how do you learn from that? And I think sometimes teams, they almost don't make enough space to learn. They maybe run the experiment, but they're already jumping to build right afterwards, and they didn't take enough time to kind of step back and go, okay, let's look through the data. What did we learn? And then what do we want to try next? And how do we decide? So it's pretty interesting. It kind of ends up being this like figure eight. And again, it's going to look very similar to other design thinking methods of, hey, we need to do both sides of this. We need to go through the business design side, and we should do that early on because again, this is why R&D groups and innovation labs really struggle and get shut down sometimes. And especially in this economy that is going to be challenged for a while because of this virus. You need to be able to align to, okay, here's the opportunity, right? And work your way through that. But also go through, how do we test that opportunity? How do we make really well-informed investment decisions? And I think everybody wants to scale. You always want to get to this point where you're like, okay, we went from kind of opportunity assessment, found where to place our bets. We placed those bets based on the risk. We experimented through that. We generated evidence, and then we made an investment, like informed investment decision based on that. And then we want to pivot, persevere, or kill that idea. So it's very much rooted in lean startup. But we've been running lean startup for like 10 years now. I mean, I was very much an early adopter of that process, mostly because I had spent my time at startups where we used agile and we used like iterative process, but we didn't spend enough time on the problem space. And I just iteratively created things nobody cared about. It was a really frustrating experience at startups. I feel like sometimes we give corporations a bad rap and we say, hey, this corporation is very dysfunctional. Like startups could be really dysfunctional too. And the only startup I was at that was really successful, that was acquired for 16 million in 2006, was we pivoted. And we didn't really call it a pivot then, but we realized we thought we were B2C, business to consumer. We ended up being a business to business startup. And that's when we took off. And I think that was a very humbling experience for me. It doesn't matter how long you spend nights and weekends building stuff. If nobody cares, they don't care. There's no amount of polish you can put on it that's going to change that. So that really kind of, I think, biased, and influenced my career. So anyway, I just wanted to draw this out for you all as far as, hey, there's both sides here. There's the business design side and the test side. And so we come back to this, and I love this quote from Theodore Levitt. It's people don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill, right? They want a 1/4-inch hole. And so when you talk about, people want holes, okay, so if you think about how we work through this process and how we write books, it comes back to, okay, so what is the job to be done behind the thing, right? And is it high value to the business and also, to the customer? And I think that's a really important distinction that Alex makes too, is that it's not necessarily just a customer problem. That's true, but then you also have to be careful if you solve for that customer problem in a way that isn't viable, right? And it's not viable because it doesn't generate enough revenue. It's not viable because it isn't tied to the strategy of the company. Then you ultimately fail because it's underfunded or it gets axed, right? So the wrong question is like, why write a book? It's kind of more like, for what job, right, does this book solve? And so it's kind of applying jobs to be done to almost even a book writing process. So what we ended up doing, and I like to call this a job story, right? So you all should kind of know these job stories. If you write a book, it should have a job story. You should have this kind of guiding light, this narrative, this overall thing where when you're writing, it's kind of like, oh, does this go in the book? Does this not go in the book? And we said, look, like for people, when they have a business idea, like I want to be able to rapidly test it so they don't build something that nobody wants. And there are other books out there that do solve for this. But I think our kind of unique value proposition and what I'd seen and through my work with companies was, people have a really hard time matching an experiment to the kind of risk they have. So there are ample tools out there for kind of defining your risk and strategy and all that. And then there are also a bunch of experiments out there, but they're scattered through like different books and also blogs and consultant decks and everything. And we thought, okay, can we do something where people can match, that risk to an experiment and make progress in a way where, they're actually making more informed decisions. And that was kind of the overall, kind of guiding story, which was, hey, if you have a business idea And it's amazing, by the way, how many people have business ideas. Like I'm literally like in the dentist and they're like cleaning my teeth and she's like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, I wrote a book on testing business ideas." And just like stops cleaning my teeth and it's like, "I have a business idea." I was like, "Of course you do." Like everybody I meet has a business idea, which is awesome. The challenge is people feel like, "Oh, I can't possibly take that idea forward," you know? And sometimes they're in a corporation and it's part of like their work there. Sometimes it's a side hustle thing, right? Where they're at a corporation, but they have a side hustle. And sometimes they're at a startup and they have the idea and they're trying to move it forward. And so I just find it's just so awesome when I talk to people and they get really excited because they feel like, man, I have this idea, but I don't know how to take it forward. You know, what do I do? Because I don't want to waste all this time building something that nobody cares about. Oh, I pull a lot of inspiration from design thinking. I try not to go for like the honeycomb diagrams and all the process, but pretty much down at the principle level of kind of like desirability, viability, feasibility. And you'll notice at the bottom here, I've quoted like Larry Keeley, Doblin, and also IDEO. It's really interesting with design thinking. It's really hard to trace it back to like a single source of truth. I've noticed, and I think it's because design thinking comes out of human-centered design and so many other different disciplines. Um, I personally stumbled across it with IDEO's work, right? But then you kind of pull that thread, and I'm like, well, Larry Keeley had his Keeley triangle, which is the same thing. And then I just gave this talk in Chicago recently, kind of before the lockdown, and there were some Dublin folks there, and they said, hey, we actually Institute of Design was kind of like where we came up with that. So every time I ask a question, it's like a layer deeper. But anyway, the big questions around these are sort of like, you know, do they? So a lot of your desirability questions around is it desirable, what assumptions are you making around kind of your value prop and the customer and how your relationships with them, and then around viability, the way I see that play out in teams is very much the should we question. And so it's like, should we be working on this? And granted, you should have a moral compass with should we too. So that aside, but also just from a viability point of view, hey, are you going to make enough revenue to cover your costs? Is this aligned to the corporate strategy? Is this something you should be working on? And I feel like sometimes we make this mistake where we spend a lot of effort kind of over here with the can we question, right? With feasibility, and we don't spend enough time with should we and do they. And so things happen, like we'll maybe interview 5 customers and then we go off and build the whole app. And it's like, really, we're gonna, I mean, I guess B2B that you might have an angle there, but like especially B2C, be very careful. Like I talked to my friends and my mom and they thought it was awesome, and then we built the whole thing. That is very risky. And then if you think about, kind of coming back to like Marty Kagan's work and this idea of balanced teams, you know, we also think, well, you could probably think of people that own each one of these or should be able to answer questions around each one of these. And so when I think about balanced teams and how we move forward, it's very much around kind of like this: do they, should we, can we? And ideally, you kind of want to be here in the middle, of course. They don't exist in isolation. For example, if you have some risk around desirability, it can also impact feasibility and viability. But there's just so much here. It doesn't matter. And I've worked with a lot of companies and a lot of different companies, everything from like deep sea exploration to automotive to just like IoT, consumer products and chemical catalysts, and everything I work with, these hold up no matter what. If you're trying to create a successful business, these 3 things are core and fundamental to you succeeding. If you just skip out on one of these, you're going to be in trouble because you're going to like check the boxes and then you're going to get stuck on something that you kind of skipped ahead on. So, what Alex and I have been doing for quite some time, but this is the first time it's been represented in a book, is kind of overlaying this on a canvas. All right. So, I use the business model canvas, obviously, because I work with Alex. There are other canvases out there, but this is kind of like the one that started it all, so to speak. And we take kind of desirability and viability and feasibility, and then we start layering it over. And so you'll notice, it's not perfect, but it works pretty well, and it's a layer on top of a tool that everybody already uses. So our whole point in like writing this book was, look, there's business model generation. It introduced the canvas. People got it. They're like, okay, finally we can put words. I mean, like visualize. It's really visual management. So the words we're using, we can visualize this and see relationships, right? And then there's value prop design, which came later, which zoomed in on value proposition and customer segment. And people started understanding like, okay, jobs, pains, and gains. What do we do to solve for those? We can create those gains. Like people start getting that too. But I think what people kept struggling with, and no fault of own of the books, but it was more of a, how do I pull it forward in a way that, because sometimes I get these canvases on the wall and I feel like, wow, there's just so much uncertainty here and so much risk, right? And so kind of the flow, it's not always the flow I use, but I tend to start with, hey, if you have a business idea, kind of what's your value prop? What's your value prop? And then who is your customer? And sometimes these are interchangeable, but you can start with customer and then go to value prop. But if you have the value prop and the customer wrong, it kind of doesn't matter what the rest of the canvas looks like in your strategy. You're going to have a really hard time, okay? Because you need to be able to use the words customers understand. You need to be able to test it with them, and then generate evidence that actually kind of helps you find your way. And then I usually move on to channels. So we talk about like how do we reach them and acquire them, and then what are the relationships we have. And I think that probably out of the entire canvas, just from facilitating hundreds of these, people get hung up on this box because they feel like, well, I don't know what a relationship with a customer looks like. And a lot of it's usually transactional, where they just buy something once and they're gone, or it might be more subscription based, where they're kind of coming back time and time again and it's ongoing. But be thinking of it as like a bi-directional thing with your customer. And then I tend to go down to the revenue stream. So I tend, when we're thinking of risk, and you'll notice there's a lot of desirability and viability risk, right? It's not always the case, but when I'm working with something new, like if we get the market completely wrong, if we get the pricing like completely wrong, or we're building something that just nobody cares about, a lot of your risk here is kind of what Alex calls the front stage of your model. And so, I tend to start on the right side, on the front stage, and a lot of your risk early on, it tends to be there. It's not necessarily in isolation, but a lot of it's there. And then moving on to, okay, so what are the activities we need to be doing? So think of the verbs that you need to be doing to pull this off. And then what are the resources you need? What does that cost? And then who do you partner with? Okay. So when I look at it this way, then you say backstage, wow, a lot of our risk is around, can we do this? And it's not always technical feasibility. And I think that's where I actually kind of disagree with some of the IDEO framing, is because I feel like when we talk about desirable, viable, feasible, we talk about feasibility in a very narrow sense. And it's, oh, can we technically build that thing? I mean, I don't know about you all, but I work with a lot of regulated industries, and so much of feasibility comes back to legislation and regulations. And like, you go into a hospital, you can build the coolest tech in the world, but if it violates HIPAA compliance, you're done. It's not going to fly. So I think what we're trying to convey with this framing of feasibility is that it's beyond technical feasibility. Okay. And it's about activities and resources, but also your partners, right? And so again, it's not in isolation, but if you think of a flow, and I went to Alex's boot camp where we talked about like the systems thinking behind this, which was fun. But you kind of, okay, you're connected to the customer through a channel. You build relationships with them through your customer relationships, and then you generate revenue from your customer. Okay. And then on the backside, you can get your costs from activities and resources that can get your costs. And then here's another thing. When we talk about partnerships, whether it's a startup or corporation, it seems to be a really ad hoc process when I'm working with teams. And so that somewhat concerns me, because if you're a startup and you talk about partners, it might just be, oh, this corporation, they really want to partner with us. Let's go. And you're kind of like, okay, you think about the speed of a startup, and then you think about the speed of a corporation. Typically, that corporation, it might take months for them just to get around to the right people to talk to you, right? And in startup, that's like dog years kind of thing, right? Where you're like, well, this is forever, and then you end up getting bankrupt because like, you went all in on a partnership that was too slow. You know, the market moved and you ran out of money. With corporations, it's also kind of ad hoc. I noticed where people go, oh, these people reached out and we should partner with them, and they're like, okay, and it's like, wait, if you think about it from a strategy point of view, your partners should be bringing key resources or key activities to help you create your value. And so if you think of it that way, then it's more like, you know, it's build, borrow, buy conversation, partnerships. It's like, oh, we have a team. We're pretty good at this stuff. We're not so great at this other stuff. That's why we should partner with somebody, because they're going to bring an activity or a resource. And that might actually, impact your cost structure. And so it's really interesting because I see this tool. If I go into Startup Accelerator, like everyone's been taught this tool, or if I go into a corporation, they've been exposed to it. But I don't know if people understand the nuance of seeing relationships with it and then seeing the types of risk that you get. And so I like it as a framing of, hey, here's where our risk is. How does this stuff relate? And then where do we start our tests? So basically, if you start writing your assumptions around, where this risk is. So literally, I just facilitate this with sticky notes. Now that we're all virtual, I use kind of virtual tools. So I'll use like the Strategizer app, or I'll use Mural or something. And then we say, okay, based on what we have written down, let's do a basic 2x2 and say, hey, here's our strategy. Here are the kinds of risk we have: desirability risk, the do they risk around value prop, channels, relationships, customer; the viability risk, which I put in green, which is kind of revenue and cost; and the feasibility risk, which I put in blue, which is activities, resources, and partners. And we say, okay, as a balanced team, all right, so this means people in the room usually at least design, product, engineering, but more than that, usually if you're talking about like legal and such, can we have a conversation where we all agree on what's the most important thing that we have no evidence to support? Okay. I first learned this by working with Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden at Neo, who wrote Lean UX and Sense and Respond. And I simply kept iterating on that exercise and then started pulling in design thinking themes and playing with the axes. So this is like, in this book, this is the third iteration of that x-axis. Just for background for you all, I first started doing this with important and unimportant, which means like important to the business, by the way, like important to us succeeding with this strategy. And then I had known and unknown. And people were like, they put it there, and I would say, why'd you put it there? And they say, well, I just know. I was like, well, how do you know? And they're like, I just know. I was like, okay, this isn't working. I mean, it was working okay, but obviously, if you get that really strong-willed executive in the room or leader, and you write all these assumptions, and they go, wow, that's not an assumption. That's a fact. Like, I know that. And so I was like, okay, so let's try something else. And then with hundreds of teams, like I've been doing this for years. And I said, okay, let's try certain and uncertain. All right. And then this situation would occur where they would stand up there and facilitate. And they were like, why did you put that there? I'm certain. Okay. Well, why are you certain? I'm just certain. I was like, no. Okay. This is not working. So then Alex and I, my co-author, had this conversation. We're like, look, we have to get people to talk about evidence, because anybody could just project confidence. But when you say, do you have any evidence? All right. That kind of pulls off that veneer, right? You're getting down to that root of, do you have evidence or not? And so it was really interesting when we finally started facilitating it this way. We're like, all these teams and years of work, it finally started occurring where teams were, oh, why'd you put that there? Do you have any evidence? Well, no. Or I just talked to one person. And finally, we had this moment where it's like, okay, this moves over a little bit, And that's a very important kind of balanced conversation you need to have based on your strategy. And then from there, okay, what experiments do you run based on that? And that was also a missing piece that was really important to me when I'm working with teams, because you kind of want to go from, okay, we have a strategy, let's map out our assumptions. Oh, this stuff here in the top right, let's go run an experiment that actually helps us learn that. And then over time, things kind of move and whatnot, and they might move down and over. You might actually replace assumptions and create new, and it's fine. It's a very iterative process. But this this idea of like, go from your strategy, write down what assumptions you're making, map those out in a way where you understand that, like, if we get this wrong, we're done. And then let's go focus our experimentation there. Like, don't focus your experimentation down here on stuff that doesn't matter right away. And I made that mistake even early on advising in companies, right? Because I had been at 3 startups. It's like 10 or 11 years of my career. Jumped into working with a bunch of companies of all sizes, and I had companies that kind of wanted to do fun stuff that they just wanted to run experiments on, but it ended up being kind of unimportant stuff that we really didn't need to experiment on. And you have to be very careful of that, because what happens is you give the illusion of progress by completing experiments. And that's not progress. Like, you have to take what you've learned and turn that learning into action and pay down the risk on what you're trying to do. And so that's why, kind of I learned from my mistakes too over the years, that if you focus on really important things that you don't have any evidence, then when you complete those experiments, it's like, okay, and this is what we learned about that risk. And then this is what we want to do next. Okay. So it's a very, very important distinction. And so what we did is basically cataloged all this. So, it was a big learning process for me, kind of writing with Alex on this. We were kind of took all the experiments we've seen, categorized them on kind of building off Steve Blank's work, which has heavily influenced my career, and also Eric Ries. But this idea of discovery, okay, what are the things we see people do and teams do, and we advise them to do when they're trying to discover, right? And it's not just go build the app, but like, what are the things, what are the experiments they run, and can we structure it that way? And so, if you read kind of Steve Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany, right, and startup owners manual, but 4 Steps is kind of I would say one of the really first works that really I got introduced to this thinking from, like, customer discovery, customer development, which is, it's kind of framed that way of customer discovery and customer like validation. And we thought, what we see time and time again is it's more than the customer. So it's more of a yes and. So yes, customer is important, and you also need to think about your price. You also need to think about Backstage. And so what we did is we kind of took all these experiments and we framed them out, like, here are the discovery experiments. So as far as like evidence strength, desirable, viable, feasible, as far as themes go, and there's not always one-to-one. Like, you'll notice some of these apply to all 3. And then we did the same thing with validation. We said, okay, what are the things we see teams do? We advise them to do. This is with a real value exchange, where they get some market validation, or they get validation on, can they do this? And so the idea here is kind of going from low strength of evidence, quick things, like interviews, surveys, et cetera, and then working your way towards that stronger experiment, okay, that tests something in a way that you feel like, oh, okay, this, we could really invest in this now, in like significant money. But I think the mistake that I see teams fall into, like kind of make over and over again, is they'll run a couple weak experiments and then they'll jump to that really strong thing, and they'll kind of make this like big leap. Hey, we talked to some customers, we ran some surveys, now we're going to build the app. It's like, well, there are some steps between you and building that app, or even like hardware and even B2B. Like, there are steps you can take along the way to kind of pay down that risk instead of just jumping to that really high risk thing. So I'll walk through a couple with you all. Again, kind of pulling from Steve's work. What really clicked with me from his book was this idea of kind of an early evangelist, early adopter. And you'll see this triangle here, right? And basically this idea of, hey, people need to have the problem, aware of the problem, then like actively seeking a solution to the problem. And so simple things like when you're running ads, so this could be B2B or B2C. When you're running ads, if you're kind of down here at the, well, we think people have this problem and we're not really sure they're aware of it. How do we generate awareness? Well, you have to tailor your advertising to generate that awareness, and you have to educate people. And you might try a lot of push techniques to push, like you'll go in LinkedIn and you'll target the people who you think are that role in that company and that geographic region. And you'll push ads to them, or you'll push white papers to them, or you push content to them, hoping to generate awareness. But if you think about it, some of the teams I've worked on, we weren't successful at doing that. Like sometimes we had a really hard time. And I think one of the reasons we had a hard time is because some of our clients were kind of up here, our customers or early, like they had the problem and they're aware and they just were trying to find a solution, but they couldn't find one. And so a simple thing here, like taking a more pull-based approach. So I had a team once where we were pushing ads, low conversions, nobody was coming over. And then when they came over, they didn't sign up. Okay. When we switched to pull-based, which was, okay, if I had this problem, what would I type into Google to find an answer? And I agree. You probably shouldn't go to Google for health problems, by the way. We all do it. You probably shouldn't, but this one was health related. And, we thought, okay, before we give up, let's try same ad, same landing page. So the ad copy was literally exactly the same. And we only served up that ad as a Google search result only ad. And what happened was we went from 0 people, almost like 0 people down here, CTR, to sorry, CTA, because it was people coming over. Up here, it was 40. That's insane. Like smaller group of people still, but we're talking like 40% people saying, yeah, I want that. So this is a really important distinction, right? So when you're working with teams, you will be, I call it, some entrepreneurs call it like the trough of despair, but you'll be put in situations where they're going to run an experiment. It's going to fail miserably and they're going to want to give up. Okay. And one of the things I'm always challenged with is, can I do this in a way where if it's the first experiment they ran, they should not give up. We need more time. And I think it's a balance because you have to kind of build morale up and get them to try different techniques. And if we run experiments over 12 weeks and all of them are terrible and none of them meet success criteria, then we should probably not go forward on that idea. But on one experiment, I mean, there's so many things that could go wrong, or you just targeted the wrong customer, or you used the wrong technique to get to them. And even with ads, I see this with ads. Like people say, well, no one clicked the ad, nobody cares. Well, they didn't click the ad because you're pushing Facebook and they were really over on Google or LinkedIn. And so taking like these concepts that are so core to product management and marketing and lean startup and just giving it some structure and saying, you know what, all those like diagrams we see in books and such, those can be very actionable, especially in a way where we say, hey, I want to target people that have the problem they're aware. How would I do that? Because we think that's awareness building. Or I need to target people that are seeking a solution. Where would I go? Where would I go if I was seeking a solution? And Google isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's LinkedIn. Sometimes it's like physical places. Maybe they go ask their doctor or they ask a nurse or they ask somebody else. So think about what's the observable evidence of people having a problem. Is there any observable evidence that they're aware of it? Is there any observable evidence of them seeking a solution? And then can we get in front of them to test something, discovery wise, really early on, that sees if we tell if we're on the right track whatsoever. Okay. There are other fun experiments in the book. We have 44 total. One is datasheet, which I like too. You'll notice here, I kind of define this as all 3. Although every time I look at this, there's always like something we need to fill in. Those all should be filled in. So you can look at a datasheet. You could go to a customer with specs, and you can start testing with them. Or you could go backstage and start testing with partners, like that build, borrow, buy conversation. We should be testing with partners too. Like, here's a data sheet. Can you actually meet these specs and these like things that we're trying to do? Just really simple stuff like this, where we take something and we kind of treat it more as an experiment. It doesn't take very long. So you'll notice like the dots here, right, is like kind of low cost. Doesn't take long as far as setup time. The evidence strength is okay. I mean, because you're actually just doing more than talking to people. And it doesn't take long to run. So I tried in the book, and based on my experiences, again, like how long does something take? How much does it cost? Does it generate strong or weak evidence? And then we also have things like capabilities. So we talk about, hey, what are the capabilities I need to pull this off? All right. So that's kind of like the taxonomy I applied. And it's really just taking everything from all these teams I've worked with and getting it into, okay, if you have this kind of risk and you want to go fast and generate this kind of evidence, here's an option. Boomerang is one of my favorite. It's also called Imposter Judo in other lean startup books. I made it the executive decision to not include Imposter Judo as the language. And also, my challenge with Imposter Judo sometimes, for those of you not familiar with it, is that people just take their competitor or another site and they just kind of throw their logo on it and test it that way. I work with a lot of corporations. That is a great way to get sued. Like I can just imagine, like we mentioned Intuit earlier on. I could just imagine working with a company and they just take like, hey, I'm just going to take TurboTax and just put my logo on it and test it. Like, no, don't do that. And so I felt like, we've been doing this for 10 years now. We were pushing the ideas forward, and some of the things, even advice I would give early on in my career, is not the advice I would give now. And it is somewhat colored by this era of kind of fake news and just not knowing what's real on the internet. But the way I framed it, which is what I do with teams, is more of like boomerang. And a boomerang is saying we're going to do competitive testing for as a test. So basically, we're going to recruit people, point them at our competitor, and then measure kind of like, hey, what kind of steps? How long did it take? Where did they get hung up? What's the qualitative feedback? And there's a lot you can do for almost no cost, because just the cost of compensating the people for the test. But that is something I see. One of funny stories, I had a large client in San Francisco, was really worried about a startup coming on that was hot. And they thought, wow, they have this really interesting value prop that's similar to us. And we think they're going to be eating into our market share. And we don't know a lot about them. And, and they literally recruited people and pointed them at that startup and then basically recorded the sessions and had them go through steps. And I felt like it must have been really awkward at that startup, because you see your traffic spike one day and you're like, wow, we're doing awesome. And it's like, no, it's like the Death Star hovering over you, because your corporate competitor is just using you to kind of test their new options. But you can do stuff without building at all. And so I do think sometimes we skip this step too, where we don't look at the competitive landscape, and then we don't spend enough time experimenting through, okay, do we have a unique value prop here? And if we're competing with something that does this better, what does that look like? One of my favorites is Concierge. So again, this is very much white glove service. You're basically contributing and creating the value and delivering it manually to the customer. It could be hardware. It also, software works really well, where you're kind of like, well, we can do all this stuff, but why don't we just do it manually and deliver it back to them? It's different than Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz is more of a man behind the curtain, where you don't have like a person interacting with you as much. So what I see there is things like, you might have a landing page or an app or something that looks like it's delivering the things automatically, but it's really just people behind the scenes manually doing it. But Concierge, similar, but you're just upfront with, okay, we're literally white glove service delivering the value to you. You can learn a lot from these. You can learn kind of what it costs to create the thing manually, how long is the output even close to what the customers want. And I think the pushback I get on this one is usually around teams that say, well, we don't have time to do that, we're just going to build the thing. And I felt like that's really, it's just not the right mindset to have, because ideally you want to spend time deeply understanding the customer and the process and the cost and what the pricing is. And then once you learn that, you could always automate steps and you could always back your way into a product. But I think if you get that output wrong, imagine if you did it all in software and really complex hardware. You could present an end product that nobody wants. And so I think we have to be careful, coming back to that premature scaling conversation that we were having earlier, which is, hey, try it manually, deliver the value, get feedback, and then you're going to learn about behind the scenes, feasibility wise, what does it take and what we can automate. And then also from the customers facing side and pricing side. So I think this one, I would like teams to do this more often, because it really taps into their creativity, and you generate evidence that is kind of all three themes: desirability, viability, and feasibility. But I want to talk about through like kind of a startup in San Francisco here. One that I met a while ago called Topology. So basically what they do is they have an app that scans your face, and then basically you make glasses custom fit for your face. So they were a case study in the book. I met them several years ago, and I just thought it was really cool how they were approaching the product development process. And the technology works, right? They can hold up the phone; it literally scans your face. I don't know if any other, uh, actually, any other app in the world that can do it as precise as they can. Like not even Warby Parker, because Warby Parker's is kind of like it's more cosmetic. They're just showing you what they could look like on your face, but these guys literally measure your face and then build glasses for your face in their factory. um, but when I started walking through what they did, they used pop-up stores, and I thought, wow, that's such an interesting kind of way to think about your experiment. And they're very much kind of more the norm here, at least in the Bay Area. I mean, they ran theirs in San Francisco, and they just rented out some space, and they kind of use that to test multiple things. And so basically, if you look through kind of the case study, and I'll walk it through here with you all, is they had a hypothesis, right? So they thought, people were identifying with the poor glasses fit, but they weren't really sure. Um, the good news is their customer segment is so accessible, you know, they can actually be standing on the street in front of their pop-up store and intercept people that wear glasses. So it's actually pretty accessible market. And then they pretty much built their pop-up store. And so long story here, but basically the high level is they intercepted people. They started asking about their glasses, how they fit. Were they kind of symptom aware? Did they understand why they didn't fit? For those that were really interested, they kind of walked them into the store where they had some of the glasses, kind of behind a case. They had an app, like a prototype app that they were testing with them. I thought was really interesting with this was they actually weren't going into this trying to sell, and they still sold 4 pairs. And these are not cheap glasses. Like at the time of like kind of this webinar, they were going for about 550 US dollars. And so the idea of wow, would people scan their face, or would they feel self-conscious scanning their face? Would they believe the technology worked? I mean, it doesn't matter how amazing your tech is if people don't believe it works. They're not gonna buy, which is a really frustrating place to be in from a product perspective. Um, and so they used these tests. They ran hundreds of these. And so basically, what they ended up doing was all these pop-up stores. They took great notes during the interviews of the pop-up stores, and they used the quotes from the customers or potential customers in their landing page copy, in their marketing copy, in their brochures. So I think this is a mistake that some teams make, where you have this gold mine of evidence that you create through your experimentation, and then it doesn't make it into the next experiment. And so something like this, as simple as taking great notes, using that as describe, because I think sometimes we fall into this trap where we're so deep subject matter experts that we use the words of the technology and the specifications and all this to communicate what we're trying to do, and the customer just doesn't understand. And so I think there's this like real kind of dilemma where we feel like, oh man, they're not signing up, they're not buying because it doesn't have X, and we add that thing to it. Whereas maybe they just don't understand what you're saying. And if they don't understand what you're saying, it doesn't matter if you add X or Y or Z or whatever. Like they're still not going to sign up. They're still not going to buy. And so I really loved just like hearing this team kind of walk through their process. Was look, we're not gonna go big on this. We're gonna keep it small with temporary pop-up stores, learn and use what we learn to inform the product design, but also inform our marketing copy. And I think, like I said, I think that kind of next feature fallacy, or as I call it, the product death cycle, where it's like you ask customers what they want and you just build that thing and they still don't use it and you just keep going through that loop. This idea of getting to that need behind it and also using words they really understand. I mean, it's just amazing what you can do versus like adding more stuff. The other thing we did in the book, and I wish I could have like basically had more time for this, which was sequences. So, for example, can you take what you learned from your interview, go online to discussion forums, and look for a broader kind of quantitative, um, data set on it, and then go competitive test what people are using now, and then build your own kind of clickable prototype, and then from there, like maybe do some pre-sales, and then build a really small MVP. Um, I have only 2 pages in the book dedicated to this. Now, We do have pairings where we talk about like what you should do before and how you could use that and then after. But I think longer sequences, I'm really excited, and readers keep reaching out to me about this too, of what people come up with. Because like, okay, I can come up with what I've seen, but what are you doing? Like, you create your own sequence. And I think as long as you're not doing something like creating a 20 experiment sequence and a waterfall plan and executing it over, like 6 months, that's not the intent. The intent is let's take what we've learned and kind of spin it into the next experiment and use what we've learned. And so I'm really excited about this, and I'm just really curious what the community comes up with, because when you start thinking about this, it's almost like superpowers, where you say, hey, if I do this and I learn something, I can actually take what I've learned and put it in this, and it's a little stronger strength of evidence, and kind of build your way up to, okay, now we're really on the right track. So I also talk about like experiment ceremonies. So this will look very similar to those of you familiar with Agile, kind of going through, hey, how do we plan? When do we have our stand-ups? How do we have learning meetings, which isn't exactly part of, Agile? Retrospectives, how do we do decision-making meetings? So, what I try to do is kind of lay out what I've seen and what I've recommended, and just give you an idea of like, hey, you're going to make it your own, but there are ceremonies, and you can kind of build this as a repeatable process, because ideally it's not like an experiment phase or discovery phase. It's kind of never done. I mean, it might not be the huge amount as far as what you do, but it should be always there. No matter what you're doing, you should always be learning and doing experiment and discovery work. So, really quickly before we do Q&A, I just wanted to say, like, hey, we couldn't write a book without testing it. So, I thought I'd give you some behind the scenes stuff here as well. So, basically, we had kind of three readers, right? We had our corporate innovator, startup entrepreneur, and solopreneur. And I thought, you know what? I've seen enough of these folks over the years. I work with startups, but I also work with big companies quite a bit. And I thought there's a huge overlap in the problems that they're solving. But then I was like, well, I shouldn't just jump to writing the book. We should probably, unpack things. And we thought, okay, so we create like value prop canvases for them. And we said, okay, what are their jobs, pains, and gains? And what is it that we do to either meet those? And so I won't go through all this with you, but if you look at kind of what we do, we're like, okay, we have a book, a method, a library. We kind of have this process, as far as pain relievers and gain creators. But do they kind of create some of these gains they're looking for? So if they're looking to impress leadership, from a corporate innovator, if they're looking to kind of understand the process, right? If they're looking to kind of map risk and do all this, um, does it fit? And we kind of created these, and it was really interesting experience, because I'm usually on the other end of this, where I'm just going into companies and saying, hey, we're going to map out all this stuff and sort it and see where your gaps are. When I'm doing on my own stuff, I kind of there's this moment where I was like, I kind of just want to write the book. It's kind of like I kind of just want to build the product, and it's hard. Like I don't know all these answers. I don't know how to test this, and so it was very really interesting experience doing on something I was creating. We also did startup entrepreneurs. Again, I won't go through all these, but this idea of like communicating, I was a big one. No, hardly any resources, kind of knowing the next move were some of the things that jumped out. And then similar to, the kind of, solopreneur, someone that has a side hustle, they see like the big thing that came out of that one was like people just fear of making a jump. They're like, you know what? I don't know if I can quit my job for this. I might sink all my weekends and, nights in this, but then is this something I should really do? And so we were iterating through it. We went through stickies. So these are stickies from like overlooking Lake Geneva in Switzerland. We were at a cabin up there writing. Basically team design. We talked about team design. We also talked a lot about the environment. And you'll notice here we said, wow, if people aren't in the right environment, it kind of doesn't matter what kind of team if they're not allowed to kind of be in an environment that makes sense. And we didn't, we basically just started sticky noting it out. And it was pretty interesting experience, right? Because like a product, right? You probably sticky note stuff out before you start jumping in and building. Then we did sketches. I just started kind of sketching out like what are the big traps I see teams go into all the time. And you'll notice like as a spread conceptually, we thought, well, here are the ones I have. You notice I just have lines here. I don't even have like the text in yet because I knew what it was, but it's a really interesting way to write a book. You'd think you'd put like the text in and then you'd kind of go in with the image. Writing with Alex, is a very different experience, I have to say. It's very much like a conceptually, are the spreads sound? Do we have the kind of things and the balance we want? Okay, now let's layer in the content. It's almost like I don't want to say the content comes completely last, but it's very much kind of similar to product development, right? Come up with like, what do you want? Let's sketch it out. Then we went into kind of a story map. I called it a book map. And so what we did is we used Mural, and we laid out the book, because I was out here like based outside San Francisco. Alex is in Switzerland, and then Alan, our lead designer, is based out of Toronto, Canada. And so we needed a way to kind of like align and move things around. And I had some big questions, right? As we laid out the book, I thought, wow, we have a bunch of experiments. If I put these up front, maybe people don't read the rest. But if I put it in the back, maybe people don't read the front and they just jump to the back. And if I put it in the middle, do they kind of get to that part and gets hung up and then don't get to the rest? And so visually, we kept moving things around. Another thing that kind of jumped out to me that my friend Andy pointed out was at the top, you'll notice all these kind of quotes. Initially, they were just like all white dudes. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm preaching like team diversity and all this stuff. And yet again, biases sink into the process. And she's like, why do you have all white dude quotes? I was like, no. I was like, okay, I'm going to remedy this. This is not my intent, right? But like little things like that, when you visualize your work, you start to see that stuff, and you get feedback on it, and you iterate and you make it better. And so we tested completely through the process. We also did a lot of kind of interviews and affinity sorted the feedback. I won't go through all these, but just basic questions like kind of like here I was asking like, what do you think? We wish it was in there that's not in there. And I noticed really early on with the content, like some people just weren't getting it. The way we had it organized was wrong. They didn't understand what I was trying to explain, and that was really hard for me because I thought like, oh, I got this, but until you test it with customers, you don't know. And so we kept testing along the way, right? It was like, let's ask, let's affinity sort. Okay, let's test the next part. Let's get feedback. And we kind of did that along the way. I also tested content online. So I built some I just went out and sketched out what I thought the experiments were going to be, and used Medium to kind of test that. So that was really interesting. You got feedback there. We brainstormed all our titles. So this is on a mountain in Switzerland. There were all kinds of titles that didn't make the cut. One of my favorite, by the way, was executing ideas. It's kind of like way down here in the corner. Because I thought, oh, executing ideas, but you're really executing ideas. And again, I think actually Dan and I have the same editor at Wiley, and he was like, no, don't. It's just like, just call the book what it does, which is kind of like, testing business ideas. We also tested all the covers. So you mentioned user testing as a sponsor. We actually used the user testing platform. And what I did is I uploaded all the different covers that we had in the works. And then I said, I recruited those corporate innovators, the startup entrepreneurs, and solopreneurs. And I said, look, imagine you're in a bookstore. Again, they still exist. Imagine you're in a bookstore and you see this book. What's it mean? Like, what do you think it's about? And that was it. And it was all open-ended. It was so painful to listen to, by the way, because there were so many things that people didn't get. And I have all these videos. They're not in this talk, but little things like these arrows here down at the bottom, people did not get the arrows. They thought like, this doesn't really convey the testing process. When we looked at some of the icons we used in the iconography, we had binoculars, but there were people that had no idea they were binoculars, and they kept going, oh, there's this thing, I don't know what it is. I'm like, it's binoculars. And the one that won, I thought had no chance of winning. And so again, proven wrong, right? I do this for a living, still proven wrong. I thought, hey, this thing right here, it has no chance. We shouldn't even test it. And I don't think our designer really appreciated that feedback, but I just thought like, there's no way. And by far, like 3-1, people loved that design. What we ended up with is pretty much that design. We've been layering on it. We've actually, there's 3 prints of this book right now. The second print has like those little rays coming out, but they're kind of subtle. And then we have another print coming out that I just sent editions to Wiley on, that will have some more references in the book with Steve Blank and Eric Ries and such. But it was so amazing to me that I was so wrong. And it's like, how could I be so wrong? And sure enough, it doesn't matter how good you are, right? How certain you think you are. when you go test it, you're always pleasantly surprised, or sometimes. Anyway, it's growing on me still. I mean, the book's solid, but I think, the testing it along the way was so important. And so one of the things I wish we would have done was we didn't time box the testing. Again, I'm an expert. I should have known that. And essentially, we topped Amazon without any, without the image cover uploaded. And so, in hindsight, if you're going to test your book this way, I would recommend time boxing your testing. I think we got into this point where it's kind of like, oh, just one more test, And in hindsight, I would have said, let's time box it. So again, you don't always know, you can't always pick the winners, and little things, right, that and you preach and you say, teams, this is the way it needs to be. And sometimes you forget when you're doing it on your own stuff. And I think it's almost like an empathy exercise, right? When you're working with teams, you need to know, okay, this is hard, and they are going not follow all the instructions. They're going to forget. And when you do it yourself, it's different, right? You will forget, and you will kind of, these things that seem so obvious, you will kind of skip over, and stuff like this happens. But basically, overall, I'm super excited how well it's doing. I'm really excited because teams are using it and people are using it, and that was my, again, job to be done behind the book. It's kind of getting people out of this only customer facing lean startup mindset and think holistically across the business model. And that was something Alex Osterwalder and I really wanted to convey. Was, yes, we have a ton of content around lean startup, and I love it. We also need to think about backstage. We need to think about feasibility and viability, and then how do we go through overall strategy and testing. And so, yeah, the book's beautiful. Again, I think it is because we spent so long testing it, and we had designers that are amazing. We had people hand drawing all the experiments. Owen Pomeroy out of England was amazing at illustrating the experiments. We had Alan and Trish, who'd worked on business model generation, value prop design, help us with the layout and everything. And I think that's really key, right? And it's with your product even. If you design something that kind of people don't know how to use, it doesn't matter how much great content you have. They're not able to accomplish their job. And so that was really important to us. And so, yeah, people send us pictures all over the world. We're going to give out 15 of these, which is amazing, to all of you who win the scroll raffle that Dan's about to do. And yeah, I'm just open to questions, and we'll see what kind of hard questions you all have for me.
So awesome. Thanks for a great talk, David. That was great. And we had a lot of good Twitter activity. And let's do some Q&A. So Cheryl asked, can your hypotheses be what your customers want to test?
Can your hypothesis be what your customers want to test? Yes, and you do need to make sure that it's still aligned to your strategy. So I think I made this comment earlier about this kind of like next feature fallacy and product death cycle. I think you do have to be mindful of being completely customer focused, and it's kind of somewhat contradictory, right? Because we have been preaching customer focused for so long, but you do need to take a step back and align it to what you're working on. So I would say if you have B2B customers, be really nervous about this one, just because B2B customers ask for all kinds of stuff. And then it comes back to like, they still don't use it after you deliver it to them. And then they go, oh, if you just had that one other thing, we'd use it. And you go, okay. And then at some point you realize it doesn't matter what we give them, they're not going to use it. So I say yes, and also just make sure it's aligned to, what your strategy is, for sure.
Right. And I didn't get a chance to chime in. I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that the bottom line is, obviously it needs to create customer value, or else it's not going to go anywhere, but you got to make sure it's creating business value. You're able to capture that value that you're creating, right? And that you don't have a market size issue, right? Your market's big enough, you can monetize it, your revenues are going to cover your costs, like all those other I thought you had an excellent point about, for feasibility, most people just think technical feasibility, can we build it? And as opposed to business feasibility, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think it's a great point. All right, cool. So let's see. Someone asked, are there examples, case studies of concierge testing in the book? Having a hard time imagining how a digital security company might test something in an analog, manual way. So maybe you can just talk a little bit more about concierge testing in certain scenarios.
Yeah, one of the case studies we have in the book isn't in security, but it's in travel. So I work with a lot with Realtor.com, and so one of their product managers, Dave Masters, who's in the book, it's kind of a funny story. He instead of building out an entire new feature and scalable thing and back end and everything, he thought, hey, people who are trying to sell their house and buy a new one at the same time, it's really hard to juggle all that. And they thought they had seen some of that in the usage behavior of the site and some of their interviews. And they thought, you know what? He's like, I can just run a concierge test where I'll put a call to action, and when they click it, I'll manually create the report for them that helps them and just send it back to them. And I'll just do it completely manually, white glove. It'll be obvious it's me putting it together for them. The mistake he made though was he's like, no one's going to really want this. I'm just going to toggle it on using Pendo. So he was using Pendo.
Right.
I'm going to toggle this on. I'm going to go to lunch. He had like 80 or 90 before he got back from lunch, and he like toggle off. And so the concierge stuff, you do have to be mindful of it because it doesn't scale.
Right.
And if you we talk about risk, we always talk risk about nobody wants it. There's also risk if a lot of people want it too. There's upside to risk. And so you do need to be mindful of, in his story, I thought was very, awesome. He was sharing that experience with us for the book, but you have to be careful of, you have to create like if it takes you, 60 minutes to create a report and you have 90 of them already, like it's like, oh my gosh, where'd my week go? So, but with security and stuff, you do have to be mindful of kind of where you do this. Like if you're doing trades and everything, maybe there's a way that you could do it, but I do think it is context specific. So certainly don't force it. Like, I worked in some really risk averse industries that this would probably be off the table because it's like, no, we can't really find a way to do it manually. But I challenge people to think of, hey, there are a lot of, like, if you tap into the creativity of your team, there's a lot of things you could do manually that you're just saying, oh, of course we can't do that. But then when you talk to your team, you're like, actually, there's a way we can do it.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard about that taken off because it sounds like you probably even throttled it, so it wasn't even 100% of traffic that got it. Right.
No,
I guess if you're worried about that, doing a smoke test first, I guess, right, just to kind of see, before you actually offer, to say, oh, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Put your email in or something. I don't know. Doesn't need a
yeah, I think
precursor.
other people say Wizard of Oz, right? And they say, well, maybe we do that. I think a lot of the AI that you, like, quote unquote AI you're interacting with today is a lot of people behind the scenes doing stuff
Right.
manually that
Right.
looks like AI. And so there
Right.
are ways you can do it. It's just you
Right.
do have to be mindful of the risk for sure.
Right. Cool. Okay. Speaking of risk, there's another question. What methods do teams use to measure the level of risk and uncertainty? How do teams know they have paid down the risk?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we just did a 2-day masterclass in London. So Alex Osterwalder and myself, he had his Invincible Company, which is his next book, for 2 days, and then I followed up with 2 days of testing business ideas with Francisca Buehler, and it was really interesting. We talked a lot about risk and pushing it beyond the book, and so there is content we're working on where if you start saying, all right, if I almost like Steve Blank's investment readiness kind of thermometer, similar to that. But if you look at desirability, viability, feasibility, and you said, hey, that's like 33.3% of each, then you can start. I mean, it's not so you have to be careful because quantitatively, you do want to be mindful of you're not giving like decimal point precision, um, kind of facing stuff and then realizing it's not that exact. So it is a work in progress, but you can start breaking down your risk per component and then adding it up overall. And then as you kind of move that stuff off, you can pay it down, right? So I think the challenge with it is risk kind of moves around. So it is kind of, it's hard to say it's always at any point zero, but we have been working on ways to make it more metrics driven. I've had some teams where I do assumption mapping that they put metrics behind the placement on the graph. I personally don't push it, but I've had people want to do that so much that they created their own graphs. So I do think if you think of the iterative process and you're always trying to pay down your risk, there are ways that you can do percentages to risk. And then also, like when you're on your map and you move this over and you go, okay, that's more known now because we ran, experiments. That is paying down the risk. So I would stay tuned on that. We are working on new content on that as well, and also with Strategizer. But right now, it's still in the prototype stage. But I think we're close.
Yeah, and just to double down, it's like double click on it, it's like how do we measure it? It's like what kind of scales, or if it's not numbers, is it like low, medium, high? Like, you know what I mean? Like what works for people to kind of, is there any kind of qualitative scale or any kind of way to think about it that
Um,
you've seen?
so it's a good question. So we are thinking more around confidence levels. And
Uh-huh.
so
Uh-huh. Right.
here's the thing: it's more like a social science. So to quote like Tendai Vicky, who I
Exactly.
love, who are like corporate startup, and he has
Right.
pirates in the Navy, which is going to be fun too. But
Yeah.
um, if you think of it like a social science, where we get in trouble is when you say, "I'm really confident about this," and someone else goes, "I'm not confident at all." Like we don't have an like a reference point for confidence,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So if you ran 5 interviews and you go, "I'm really confident," it's like, no, you shouldn't be really confident. You just read 5 interviews and it's just talking to people. You have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think what we're trying to do is kind of put a confidence level around this stuff, also with the themes of desirable, viable, feasible, and get it to a point where, at least from a social science perspective, we could say we agree on how confident we are. And I think that foundation needs to be done, because overall, like, then you do this and you say, well, I'm really confident. I'm not confident at all. And they're like, wait, what's our definition of confidence? Like,
Right.
it could be
Well, that makes me think of
tricky.
like the ladder of inference. Like, are we operating from the same data set or not? Are we applying the same, filters and values to that kind of a thing? So that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right. So Jorge had a question. Material is very good and powerful. One hard point is how to start the design of the experiments in a good sequence. I have a problem to define how to test just one thing at a time. Any recommendations for how to choose how to perform the prioritizations or sequencing of the tests?
Yeah. So I mean, it may have been tough to read at the slide level, but back when I
You want
was
to pull it back
talking
up?
about,
You can pull it up if you want.
yeah, I
Yeah.
might.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
So when I had, yeah, it was just really small. So let me
Yeah.
share my screen again. I'm not going to draw this time, but
Okay.
if you look up here, kind of, we had some rules.
Hmm.
And so, like, go cheap and fast early on in your journey, increase your strength of evidence with multiple experiments for the same hypothesis. Always pick almost like their next best test. So, experiment that produces the strongest evidence given your constraints, and then reduce uncertainty as much as you can before building. So those were kind of like the principles we had around discovery. So it's
Hmm.
kind of like, okay, where are you in the process? And to be fair, like, some teams I work with, they're not super early on. Like, they've already got some evidence, and they just want to look for that, like, what's the next thing we do. And then
Hmm.
for validation, it's similar, but it's more like you're further along in the journey there. So you'll notice, if you look through the book, like, the strength of evidence is usually a lot higher on the validation experiments, because if you have an MVP that you're testing, like, it's going to give you better evidence than just talking to people. So um yeah, so we have kind of these overall rules, but it's basically like, how do you choose something based on the theme of risk, and then we match the themes to the experiments. So, like, if you have a lot of desirability risk, here's some things you could do. Viability, here's some things. Feasibility, here's some things. And then kind of go on, okay, this is what I've done so far. What's the thing I can do that's, like, not super expensive but gives me more evidence?
Hmm.
And so that's why we kind of use those dots and everything in the book as well.
Hmm. 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 Got it. Cool. That's great. Okay. Let's see what else we got. How would you convince those resistant executives, to approve testing business ideas where they want to see sure ROI on that idea?
Yeah. So what works for me usually is, it's funny. I kind of gave you a whole talk about tools, but not leading with the tools,
Hmm.
and leading with the outcomes, and leading with language that your executives understand. And so we fall into this kind of trap sometimes as consultants and as advisors of, we'll use a lot of buzzwords, and it doesn't go over well. Or we'll lead with the tool, and people are like, you're more excited about using that tool than actually helping us solve this kind of problem with the company or achieve an outcome. That's not your intent. I get it, but that's what they hear. So I think being able to say, use words like investment decision, and being able to pay down risk, and words like that, like, let's just go check, there are ways you can have those conversations where you're not leading with a tool, and you're using words that your executives get. And so I've yet to meet, I mean, of course, the executives, it's hard to paint it with a broad brush, but for the most part, like, people want to succeed, right? And so I think using language and not leading with the tools goes a long way in that regard.
Cool. Okay. And then someone here is talking about pre-product market fit companies. Pre-product market fit companies do not typically have a ton of time or means to try different tests. How do you balance between running a test long enough versus understanding it as a dead end?
Yeah, I mean, I work with all pre-product market fit stuff. I mean, if I'm working with startups and startup accelerators, all of them are pre-product market fit. And if I'm working with corporations, I'm working with um, basically their incubators, their emerging product groups, their innovation folks, and it's all pre-product market fit. I think I think there is something culturally there about the time that we feel like, oh, we have to be building something or we're wasting time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not unique to what we do. I mean, if you go into a design sprint, usually the first question is like, well, do the engineers have to be here? And it's like, well, they could be busy building. I was like, well, they could be busy building the thing nobody cares about, or you could just
Right.
have spend some time in the sprint, you know? So there's a cultural thing there where we feel like, oh, we haven't found the signal yet, so we have to keep building. And
Right.
I would say it's almost the opposite. You need to bucket time for this. So if I'm working with like agile teams, think about capacity planning. Okay, if you capacity plan like for tech debt, for stories, and what else, you need a capacity plan for discovery, and it just needs to be part of how you work. And so I think this
Mm-hmm.
idea of it's like there's not enough time. You have to make time, but it also becomes part of your capacity planning. So it's not like 100% discovery, but it might be 20% discovery.
Mm-hmm.
You're on the hook for building stuff. So and then the second part of this is oh, how do you balance running a test long enough versus understanding it's a dead end?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my kind of overall rule is experiment a week. Now it doesn't mean that experiments can't run longer than a week, but I like that as an overall rule of like, hey, we're trying to learn every week.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I try to run for 12 weeks. So, if you run for 12 weeks and you have no evidence to point you in a direction, you should probably pause the thing. And then it's tied to that decision meeting that I had in the ceremonies list where we
Sure.
say, hey, let's tie this
Sure.
stuff to funding. And so that's probably another big thing we need to solve is how do we fund these kinds of efforts? And I know
Mm-hmm.
Eric Ries has been trying this, and I've been trying this where we do like internal VC funding at companies. Um, but that helps a little bit because then you're tying the funding decision to the evidence you've generated.
Right.
Otherwise, you might make the mistake of like experimenting a little too long because there's no like
Mm-hmm.
decision meeting going on where you kind of make that pivot, persevere, kill call. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Dan, what you've seen.
Yeah. No, I think it's the same. Yeah, I've done similar. It's funny ceremonies where it's like every 2 weeks we have teams come in and present, and it's basically like an experiment sprint, and then you're kind of and the question is like how long do you let things go on? So that's a good question. Related to that, I guess another question was, it says the way it was question asked was when are good times to be directional versus action? I guess another way to ask would just be how much how do you decide when like further confidence investing in trying to get further confidence is warranted versus hey that's enough like we should move on, make a decision and move on. I guess sometimes I see teams when I help them with transformations, they suddenly like get into kind of not like analysis paralysis, like oh yeah it's all about learning and we got to keep iterating and validating iterating, and then they're not actually making decisions and executing. So how do you strike that balance, or what are some advice on how to be less accurate versus more accurate in what situations?
Yeah, I mean, you can't let being right get in the way of making progress. So that's one thing. The other is it's I think we have this saying where it's like we have to learn faster than everyone else. That's part of it. I mean, you have to turn that learning into action, and you have to act faster, right? And so the market's not going to reward you for just learning. I mean, it's great. I like learning. I want my teams to learn. I want to learn about the market and themselves and how to get better.
Yeah.
But you do have to put it into action. And I think that's why that loop is so important. Where we're talking about, okay, this is what I learned, and let's make it. Let's like put it into action and make a decision.
Right.
So I do think we have to be careful with only emphasizing the learning, and then obviously you need to be able to fail and not get fired, but failure isn't the goal either, right? It's like learning from it and putting it in action and keep going. And so yeah, it's a tough question, but I think it's really tough sometimes to say like how long should we go or how many pivots should we make, or
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I guess I can say from experience from startup, we had one pivot, we raised some money. I don't know if we had enough money for another pivot. I
Right.
don't think we would
That's
have survived another one. So
right.
In a corporation, it's a little different. You might have enough money to go on forever, but at the same time, when I'm in those decision meetings with executives, what we do is we say, here's the risk we had, like here's the experiments we ran, here's the evidence we generated, and this is what we recommend, and this is what we need from you. And I think if you frame it that way, you can also have input from your executives that's constructive in the sense of,
Right.
I'm not just giving you verbal language of go experiment, but I'm actually going to support you. I think if you frame it that way, when you go into those decision meetings, you should have, a kind of better framing, and get better feedback versus like, having it open-ended. So I do put some structure around that too. So it
Mm-hmm.
helps when you go into those sessions.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, cool. Well, I think that was the last question. So why don't we, let's see, wait, oh, there's one more here. There's one last question. Okay. Oh, okay. So Brian was asking, mapping evidence to business outcomes is a big challenge. Would love to see a future book on the topic, which helps teams map their product UX work to some future revenue estimate. Any thoughts on how to do this? And I see this every once in a while when I have a company or client that's so financial driven and the finance team has these estimates and it's like, okay, you've got these financial estimates, you've got this product roadmap. How the heck do you know that they're in concert or they map? It's just, you know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
It's probably my co-author's superpower. It's partly mine, but I think I would say I would default to him. So Alex actually does have a new book coming out called Invincible Company,
Okay.
where he literally looked at all these different patterns and mapped them all out of here are the different ways that companies were able to establish a foothold. And so I do think that could help. And it is a lot about assessing ideas and looking at patterns. So I think if you can marry up, like, what are the patterns? Are we aware of them and understand them? And then here's what our roadmap has. And do these things, are they are they contradicting each other or are they
Right.
aligned? That could
Right.
potentially help.
Right.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But I think his new book, it comes out April 14th, I believe. So
Okay.
it's soon.
Okay, cool.
I would recommend picking that
Great.
one up too.
Awesome. Sounds good. Cool. Awesome, David. Well, thank you so much for the talk. Thanks for the Q&A.